What's going on, pro wrestling fans? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jose Ramos Jr. and as promised, here is an in-depth look at the latest docu-series that Netflix has released, all about Mr. McMahon. Now, before I do a deep dive into the topics that were discussed throughout the course of this docu-series, I think it's important to recognize what Vince has done for the business. Granted, for better or for worse, however you want to look at the individual, the man that is Vince McMahon, I think it is very difficult to really accept that he was a huge part of the business and how it has grown into what we have seen. Differentiating the personal man from the businessman is difficult for some, just like it's difficult for them to differentiate the character from the individual. And we will dive into that, of course, as I mentioned in the short little reaction that I uploaded earlier this week. But what he was able to do with his father's company, Vince McMahon Sr., we saw how it grew from the WWF and how once Vince McMahon Jr., the Vince McMahon that we know, acquired the company, how soon he was able to turn it on its head and become the global phenomenon that we know it to be. The Netflix docuseries was something that was a lot of people's interest. It wanted to cover a wide variety of topics throughout the course of not only his career in the WWE, but also throughout his life. A lot of speculation was, created as to what topics would they shy away from. Would they be including all the major scandals that he has ever been associated with? And after watching it, as I previously mentioned in that other video earlier this week, if you kept up to date with a lot of pro wrestling history, specifically that of the WWE and anything that's associated with Vince, you don't really learn anything new. And upon learning that, upon viewing the docu-series, it really became apparent. I know for other pro wrestling fans that have been talking on the internet, it's been a common, criticism, I guess is an appropriate word to use, is that when it comes to the scandals, when it comes to the controversies that surrounded Vince, nothing really new is learned. A lot of this stuff is public knowledge. Now, what I found most, entertaining, most interesting was that of the testimonials, the interviews that had included the likes of, people in and out of the business. We had talking heads from guys like Paul Heyman, John Cena, Cody Rhodes, Stone Cold, The Rock, and then outside of the business as well, like a Bob Costas, like the Dave Meltzers of the world, and the other reporters who have covered the extensive history that is Vince McMahon. Now, with that being said, in this video, I wanted to tackle each important topic and share my opinions, as well as, really just describe the presentation that they took for the docuseries itself. There's a lot of ground to cover, and that's why I wanted to take this time today to speak to all of you, speak with you, because I want to hear you guys in the comments as well below on as to how you feel in regards to these controversies. Were these some topics that you were aware of? And if you already were, anything changed? Were you swayed in any way? What were your thoughts on the portrayal of Vince McMahon as not only the businessman, but just as the individual as well? We saw an early take on Vince McMahon and how his upbringing wasn't that of a traditional upbringing. What I found interesting, and this is something I didn't know, was that he did not have a relationship with his father until the age of 12, or the first 12 years of his life. He didn't even recognize or realize that his last name was McMahon. And as someone who was very prideful and just honored by the name that they have or the father that they have, it's unfathomable for me to know that someone of his stature, someone of his caliber, again, in the business standpoint, because we'll dive into the personal life, that was something he had dealt with. He had mentioned that he had experienced some levels of abuse from his stepfather and allegedly his mother as well. But Vince McMahon, upon, starting that relationship with his father, it always became a fight for his approval, for his respect, for his love, in a sense. Something that we will explore later upon meeting Shane McMahon, of course, the son of Vince McMahon. We knew that Vince wanted to get into the business, whether it was in ring, whether it was behind the scenes. He wanted to be a part of the business that his father helped began. Now, obviously, pro wrestling isn't something that the McMahons began, but it's definitely an apparent reality that it is something that they help grow, right? We did talk about the early years of the WWF once Vince McMahon, our Vince McMahon, not his dad, once he acquired and purchased the WWF, then becoming the WWF. A lot of W's, I know, but the initial plan was to expand. Now, I really enjoyed the early discussions about the territories and how everyone had their selective areas throughout the country that they helped distribute their brand of professional wrestling, whether it was Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, or the Northeast that the McMahons really worked on. Since then, Vince would start to acquire talent from other promotions. You saw him poach talent, really. Guys like Roddy Piper, guys like Junkyard Dog, guys like Hulk Hogan. He would go around and selecting the best of the best, offering them better opportunity, and I'm assuming better pay. Now, of course, they didn't cover this in the docuseries, but then there was Black Saturday, how Vince McMahon really started purchasing all of his competitors, something that his father promised his competitors that he would not do. He would not put anyone out of business. There was a level of respect when it came to the business. Vince McMahon didn't look at it as a sense of disrespect and respect. He was trying to improve. He was trying to grow his product. And if that meant by getting the best of the best from other territories and forcing them to fold essentially, then so be it. He was going to do what was best for business. Now, in the early years, of course, we didn't see much change in the industry until we get to the Rock and Wrestling connection. Now, that, again, another highly touted time in professional wrestling when the WWF and MTV were coming around. We saw the inclusion of Cyndi Lauper, who, by the way, I think it is a crime, is not in the Hall of Fame yet for her contributions to the early years of WrestleMania and the MTV WWF connection. I don't understand how there are, no disrespect to guys like Snoop Dogg and Muhammad Ali. I love those guys. But there are some members in the Hall of Fame, the celebrity wing, guys like a Donald Trump, guys like a Drew Carey, who are in the Hall of Fame. And fine, you want to validate that, that's fine. But then that means someone like Cyndi Lauper should definitely be in the Hall of Fame. That's just my 2 cents. We go into the early years of WrestleMania where Vince wanted to create a Super Bowl of some sorts for pro wrestling. He wanted a marquee event where it was basically the season finale of wrestling, right? And that would become WrestleMania. Leading up to WrestleMania, there were a couple of controversies that had arisen in the wake of this newfound attention and notoriety that was in the Federation. The early 2 that we got was the David Schultz slap. Now, forgive me for not remembering the reporter's name because everyone knows David Schultz and his kind of rocky history when it came to his behavior. But the story goes, and of course, if you watch the docuseries, you know that he had gone around asking questions about wrestlers, basically enticing them and antagonizing them as to whether or not it was fake, and really questioning the validity of the business. So the story goes that Vince McMahon went around the locker room saying, hey, there's a guy out here interviewing people, trying to demean the business that we love, demean our work, and saying something along the lines of, I really wish someone would teach him a lesson or put him in his place. Not verbatim, something along those lines. So David Schultz takes it upon himself, upon being interviewed, and he slaps this guy, not once, but twice, apparently causing damage to his hearing and beginning a trial, or rather, a lawsuit action from this reporter to David Schultz that would be settled in court. Not too long after, rather. Leading up to WrestleMania, Mr. T and Hulk Hogan, of course, a lot of Hulk Hogan in this as well. And why wouldn't it be? He was one of the first major stars under Vince McMahon, as well as one of the biggest stars in professional wrestling. But they go on the John Stossel show, and again, well-known event. A lot of these were well-known events. Goes on the show and is questioned about the validity of professional wrestling and whether it is fake. He decides to put John Stossel in a chokehold, kind of reminiscent of like a guillotine hold, if anything. Puts his arm underneath his chin and begins to squeeze until finally he falls, basically unconscious, smacks the back of his head on the floor. And take some time to revive him, and everyone thinks, okay, whatever. Hulk Hogan apparently thought it was some kind of gag and that he wasn't really completely out, but he was playing along, which is, I think, I think that's very ignorant and naive of Hulk Hogan to think, because you're a professional. You're a professional wrestler. You know what to do. This is a guy who's already questioning you whether it's real or not. Do you think he's going to want to play along and only provoke you to continue the chokehold? No. He falls on his head. And there's a moment there where he turns to the audience and you can see blood pouring out from the back of his head in what was, at the time being very graphic. I'm guessing. Because of the early 80s, we're not really as desensitized to violence as we are now. That, again, results in another lawsuit that would be settled, which was a common theme throughout the course of this docuseries. One thing I really did appreciate is at the end of each episode, there was a listing, a print, where it would describe and list the lawsuits or any of the allegations that targeted Vince and the WWE, and it would give you the result. And a common theme were that a lot of these were settled in court. The WWE knew how to get rid of these, maybe not get rid of, but kind of hush these controversies, these scandals, rather. And they really didn't have any repercussions. There were some, like I said, that we'll get into those. But I thought that was a very interesting theme that we talked about. Another one that I thought was very telling was the relationship between Vince and his father. That, I think, set in motion for this character arc that is Vincent K. McMahon, and not the character that we see on TV, the evil boss, Mr. McMahon. I'm talking about the individual, Vince McMahon. That seeking for approval, the seeking for love that Vince had constantly yearned for, trickled down to that of his own children. We saw very in detail his relationship with his kids, Shane and Stephanie, who I cannot imagine what they're going through, knowing that their father is under so much scrutiny, so much criticism, rightfully or wrongfully so, however you want to look at it. I know my stance on it. But Shane, very much so, like Vince, yearning for his father's approval, yearning for his father's love, which would explain why he was doing all these death-defying acts, whether it was jumping off of the Titantron, doing the coast-to-coast, hitting these dangerous maneuvers. I mean, look no further than the 2001 King of the Ring matchup against Kurt Angle. I feel like, in his own way, it was his way of earning respect, not just for his father, but from the boys. And speaking as a fan, I knew watching Shane McMahon that he wasn't a traditional wrestler. He wasn't, going to give us those classics like a Kurt Angle, like a Shawn Michaels. But where he did earn people's respect is he wasn't afraid to put his body on the line. He had that sense of respect that everybody does in the ring, and it's a team effort. It's a collaborative effort to put on the best possible show. He may not have been the mat technician of like the guys I just mentioned, but he certainly was going to be willing to give his body for the entertainment, for the betterment of the business. And you saw how it really affected him at the end of WrestleMania 32, his Hell in a Cell matchup against The Undertaker, and how emotional that was between him and his father, and how he finally got that hug, he got that pat on the back, and it was an emotional moment for the family, really. I've said it before, and of the four, whether it's Linda, Vince, Stephanie, and Shane, I think Shane is probably the easiest one to root for. Whether you agree with his booking decisions, in the latter parts of his career with the WWE, like in the 2022 Royal Rumble, as a person, I think it's very easy to root for him, and you feel for the guy. You really do. I really enjoyed seeing that aspect of the docuseries where they talk about Vince's relationships, whether it's with his kids, whether it's with his wife, just the family stuff, because that's stuff we don't know. That's not something that we have access to. We've seen documentaries. We've heard so much talk about these controversies in his career and in his life, but rarely do they really give the opportunity for the fans and for just the public, really, to be exposed to his family life and what their thoughts are in regards to some of these storylines. For example, the 2001 storyline where Trish Stratus was a mistress to Vince McMahon, and they were here, making out in front of Linda McMahon, and how that really bothered Shane, not only in kayfabe, but in real life, and how it became such a lack of a better term, a toxic relationship, because you're blurring the lines between reality and fiction. And yes, it is a business, and we understand that. And as a fan of pro wrestling, I can understand that. I get it. But at the risk of your relationships with those you're closest with, there has to be a line, right? You would think that there's a line that you don't cross. Now, whether or not they are complicit in it and they're down for these storylines and you keep moving forward, that's one thing, and that's a decision for them to make. But at the end of the day, you are the boss, and I feel like the line has to stop somewhere. You want to talk about lines? They also share the build to WrestleMania VII, where with Sergeant Slaughter versus Hulk Hogan, and this was around the time that Hulk Hogan, his time at the top was seemingly numbered. The fans weren't as receptive to Hulk Hogan as they were 7 years ago. Times were changing. Times were evolving. They wanted something new. They wanted something fresh. And this was during, the Desert Storm. This was during the War, 91. And having Sergeant Slaughter, who typically portrayed the baby face of the all-American hero, he was a G.I. Joe, for God's sake, having him turn heel and become a sympathizer for the opposition, it was very touchy for the time being. And for me personally, as a wrestling fan, I am a fan of when they push the envelope and when they get so close to the line it's uncomfortable. It's fascinating to see how close they are willing to steer in that direction of pushing the envelope. Now, granted, they talked about the death threats. They talked about all the danger that Sergeant Slaughter and his family were put in because of this gimmick change, because of his heel turn. One thing they didn't mention was how at WrestleMania 7, it wasn't originally supposed to be in the LA Coliseum, and there's a dispute there. They didn't talk about it, but it's a well-known dispute that rumors are saying that there might have been a threat on the stadium, which is why they had to change and they went to a smaller venue. Another reason, again, this is all speculation, is that they were unable to sell a decent amount of tickets in the LA Coliseum, so it would have seemed a little bit more empty than they would have liked, thus having to move to a small arena. Whether or not you believe in that speculation or that conspiracy, the fact remains it was intended to be in the LA Coliseum, and it wasn't. They had to move to a smaller venue. 91, of course, was also the turn of a lot more controversies, a lot more scandals in the direction of not only Vince, but the WWE. The big one being, of course, the Steroid Trial. It's been covered ad nauseum. I won't dive in too much about it because I have a previous video where I talk about the Steroid Trial and how it still carries over to this day in professional wrestling. But obviously, it's what it is. It's exactly what it sounds like. Dr. Zahorian had been prescribing steroids to members of the WWF. Vince McMahon has even gone on the record saying that, yeah, he had taken steroids, but that he had not encouraged his wrestlers to do so. I think the way they explained it, it makes sense to me. Now, whether or not this is them covering for each other, again, speculation, we don't know, we weren't there. But it makes sense. It's not something that you have to tell someone like, hey, you got to take steroids to be the number one guy. They don't have to say that. But seeing that your top guys are like a Hulk Hogan, are like an Ultimate Warrior, who have these hulking physiques, larger than life characters, literally and figuratively, and those are your top guys, that's going to make your other guys think, well, I got to look like him. In order to be successful, in order to be at the top, I got to look like him. So there comes that sense of peer pressure. And so naturally, everyone's going to start juicing, and before you know it, you have a locker room filled with steroids. And whether or not the call was correct, it's still a topic that, again, carries a lot of weight. It influenced the way the business changed. It influences the way the business was. It put out the WBF because Vince McMahon has a thing for bodybuilders, which I don't get. I get the sense of like, okay, bodybuilding, but to start your own federation. And he's known for starting his own federation. Look at the XFL. The XFL, one season, done. I can respect as a businessman, as an entrepreneur, that you want to take these risks. You cannot, succeed without taking some risks. And we have the benefit of 2020 and hindsight and looking back and saying, oh yeah, duh, no, of course it didn't work. But in the moment, I get it. I can understand it. And I can respect that as a businessman, right? But sometimes it's better to just you know, I don't want to say stay in your lane, but you got a good thing working for you. You got a good thing working for you. Of course, there was a steroid trial, but around that same time, there was the Ring Boy scandal, which doesn't get talked about a lot. It's a very, very touchy subject. And at the risk of diving too deep, I won't get too deep into it. But if you watch the docuseries, you obviously know. Accusations that there were teens who were ring boys. They helped put up the ring, they helped set up the arena, that they were being sexually assaulted from members of the staff. And they have names on file on who was involved, which left a really bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. And it's just a shame that it came to that. And to know that there were individuals, innocent individuals, who were placed in that kind of harm, it never should have happened. One thing that was alarming was like a guy like Bret Hart. I don't think Bret Hart has a lot of motive to lie and bury Vince McMahon more than he already has, because we already know the reputation. They've already made up for the whole Montreal thing, and for him to say things like, yeah, that he kind of believes it. Like, he didn't see anything, but he can buy it. Of course, around the same time, there was the Rita Chatterton, the female referee, which that one I have no difficulty in believing. She was the first female referee. Vince McMahon has a track record, and I was watching this with my brother, of course, both growing up huge fans of professional wrestling, and he made a comment once he saw her appearance. He said, "Of course, it's a blonde." And it's like, if you look at a lot of the long list of individuals that he's either A, been associated with, or B, that he's even scripted to have on-screen affairs with, it's always a blonde. Like, apparently we know that Vince has a type, but knowing that she was the first female referee, of course, I think there was always going to be that chance that some of these individuals, these wrestlers who are very high on testosterone, are going to act out. And it's unfortunate that allegedly the one who would do it was at the top, and that was Vince McMahon. Whether or not that was a true accusation, and that's another thing too. So many accusations thrown at Vince, whether it was the steroids, whether it was Rita, whether it was a bunch of more other topics that we'll get into. We can't believe that every single one of them is true, right? It wouldn't be fair to just assume he did all these things. And I'm not saying he's innocent, but what I will say is, when you have a reputation, it precedes you. I don't know whether every single one of these is true or not. We'll never know, obviously. A lot of these are speculation. Some have more concrete evidence than others. But what I want to say is, when you have so much against you, and you have this reputation, you now don't become a reliable source. It's difficult to believe Vince. It's really, listening to his interview, which is what I was mostly interested in. I talked about all the other names that they had included in this docuseries, but hearing it from Vince, seeing his body language and how aloof he was about some of these topics was very telling. One of those, of course, was the Sable one. I know I'm jumping, quite some time ahead, but they talk about the Sable lawsuit about sexual harassment and the allegations in that as well. And Vince kind of brushes it off as if he didn't know about it, or he didn't, it's whatever. Like, he kind of, it was a blur. He described it. He says the only thing he remembers is that she came back to work. And I'm like, dude, either one, no, not even, there's three. Either one, you're old, you're losing sense of reality, and you're just forgetting stuff. Two, you have so much allegations against you, you're losing track of what has happened. Or three, you're straight up just denying it. And that's ridiculous to think about, that you're going to deny that when it's well known that it was this whole thing, that she sued them millions of dollars for sexual harassment, something that they even acknowledged on SmackDown in 2003 upon her return. Vince is not stupid by any means. What I think he can be is overconfident, overzealous, and at some points arrogant, because if I'm looking at it from the standpoint of Vince McMahon, he is in control of creative. If I'm looking at Vince a certain way, and I'm pretty sure he's done it, he's writing storylines that are mirroring reality, almost poking fun at it. For example, we talk about I'm gonna jump all over the place here, but we talk about in 2006 at the tanning salon where someone accused Vince of groping her. and again, allegations, he's saying it's nothing happened, it's false. And then around the same time, Mickey James, I remember this story. I don't remember the allegations, but I remember watching TV, seeing the Mickey James thing, and having her portray, I believe it was either Ashley's or Trish Stratus's on-screen, character boyfriend, and accusing him of touching her when it didn't happen, almost making fun of the actual allegations. Jim Ross is another one. On-screen humiliation of guys like a Jim Ross for public things like his Bell palsy. Vince, I don't, and this is where I dive into it. That when you really look at it, that's just evil. Like, you don't have to do that. It's one thing about the treatment of women, but when you look at it from the Jim Ross standpoint, and I don't want to undermine any of the allegations involving the women because it's Jim Ross, but when you're willing to do that for the sake of a laugh, that tells me your sense of humor. So that to me destroys your credibility. And you can't just use the whole it's entertainment, or you can't use the whole like it's kayfabe. There comes a time where you can't use that. There has to be a sense of discretion and, again, a sense of drawing the line. You are the boss. You have to draw the line. And he really struggled with that throughout the course, which leads me to another great segue here about blurring the line, drawing the line, and that is the screw job. The screw job, how that episode started, I thought was fantastic. They started the screw job episode. Obviously, we know that is in reference to Montreal, Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart, Survivor Series 97. But the way they began that episode was the original screw job. Wendy Richter, one of the early top stars in women's wrestling in the WWE, had won the WWE title, or excuse me, the WWE Women's title, alongside Cyndi Lauper, who was her manager at the time, and she didn't want to lose the title. Vince McMahon, and this part I get, the whole Vince McMahon, it's the business, you have to lose the belt, it's a time-honored tradition. I get that. I totally get that. But then there's a screw job with Fabulous Moolah, and he has her defeat Wendy Richter under the guise of the Spider. And what they do is they have not a fast count, but they have her roll Wendy up. Wendy clearly kicks out, but they continue the count and they take the title away from her in a moment that was devastating. She said it was something that hurts her to this day, and of course she would be inducted in the Hall of Fame decades later, but you have to imagine that stings, right? Which leads us to Montreal. I don't think I need to talk about Montreal a lot because it's, again, another one of those topics like the steroid trial that has been talked ad nauseum. Everyone knows about it. Was it a work? Was it a work? Was it fake? Whatever. The fact of the matter is, it happened, and it's a huge nexus point in professional wrestling. So many things come because of the Montreal Screwjob. So many things are influenced and affected because of the Montreal Screwjob. I'm not going to dive too much into it because it's something that pro wrestling fans are probably tired of hearing. Me personally, I don't, because I think it's one of the more fascinating things. For me, it's up there in terms of like conspiracies with like the Kennedy assassination. Everyone knows about the Kennedy assassination, but we still talk about it and discuss it because it's one of those things where you can't fathom that it actually happened. And Montreal was his call. I totally get that. I totally get that it's your business. And at the time, WCW was red hot. We already saw Medusa / Alundra Blaze bring the Women's World title to WCW and threw it in the trash. He didn't want that for the WWE title because that would destroy the credibility of their promotion. But you want to talk about calls. We also have the curtain call, where it was members of the Clique, Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, another nexus point in professional wrestling that helped, alongside Montreal, help usher in the Attitude Era. And the Attitude Era, there was this one bit that a lot of people were talking about and I thought was very humorous, in that he was trying to defend the Attitude Era. He, being Vince, was trying to defend the Attitude Era as it was still family friendly. And he said something along the lines of like, no one died. And they showed clips of like buried alive matches and casket matches. What I'm surprised they didn't show was Owen Hart, and we will get to that. He talked about, there was no use of guns or knives, and it's like you had Brian Pillman pull out, his 9mm. So it's like they were fact checking him right then and there. It's like, dude, like, it wasn't family friendly. He argues, well, maybe for adult families, but not for children. It's like, okay, but let's be honest, professional wrestling has always been something that has attracted the viewers that are under the age of like 15. I mean, let's face facts. A lot of you guys who are watching this video now, you probably became fans of pro wrestling when you were kids. I know I did. I became a fan when I was like 2 years old. I started watching. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure that out, Vince. And it's just another one of those things where he, along with the WWE, they kind of tend to rewrite history, and that's why it was so interesting to watch this documentary, because it wasn't under the umbrella of WWE. It was a Netflix docu-series, so they got to tell the story that they wanted. It wasn't revisionist history. It was just an overview of all of the events that have occurred in his career and in the history of the WWE. We talked about the Sable lawsuit, of course, because this was in the Attitude Era. We mentioned Owen Hart. Let's talk about Owen Hart and what is, I think, the most devastating piece, maybe one of the most devastating pieces in this docu-series. Just knowing what happened to Owen Hart. It's a tough subject, and it's a shame for what had happened. And there's always that question of, should the show have continued? And of course, unfairly, we have hindsight. We have 2020 vision. We can look back and see, was it the right call? In the moment, from a business standpoint, I get it. I get it. These guys in the crowd, the audience, they don't know. They didn't tell the audience. They didn't tell the live audience what happened to Owen. They continued the show because they paid their money to see a show. They didn't come to see someone die. The fact is, someone did die. Someone did die. Whether they wanted to see it or whether they knew it or not, someone horrifically lost their life. He mentions that it was a business standpoint. I'm looking at it from a moral standpoint, man. Like, if it was me, it would be very difficult for me to live with myself knowing that we continued on. You saw the reactions of guys like Jeff Jarrett, guys like The Undertaker, who don't sell. He doesn't wear his emotions on his face like that, and you could tell visibly he was upset. Not like in a mad, upset, but that like, wow, like Owen's gone. And the fact that you could see his blood on the mat still throughout the course of the pay-per-view. If I'm not mistaken, I believe the match that Owen Hart was supposed to compete in was against the Godfather. I believe that might have been in the first hour. And these shows typically run between 2.5 to 3 hours of a pay-per-view. So you're fighting 2 hours with the blood of Owen Hart on the mat. That was a bad call. I think it was a bad call to continue that show. They should have stopped the show. And another point too is, it's technically, would it not, right? I'm no expert when it comes to forensics. Would it not be considered a crime scene? Someone has just lost their life. There was blood on the mat. Is that not considered a crime scene? They had to do an investigation on the apparatus that was used in the stunt. I don't know if that ever got talked about. I know it didn't get talked about in the docu-series, but did it ever really get talked about in the court, in the lawsuit that was made? Again, another lawsuit that was settled in court. Unfortunately, Owen Hart wouldn't be the only death in wrestling that they talked about. They talked about Chris Benoit, which is a very taboo subject. I have really talked about it maybe once on this channel, and I've been talking pro wrestling for a long time, when it comes to my YouTube life. Again, another tough subject, and it really introduced the topic of CTE and concussions, which I think is a very important topic to discuss when it comes to mental health, when it comes to the anatomy of the brain and its importance and the functions of daily activities. But what Chris Benoit had done, unfortunately, it can never be forgiven, whether or not it was because of a brain injury or not. What happened, happened. And there is a good reason why they do not speak of him on WWE TV. I think that's for best case scenario. For those who watched him as a professional wrestler like myself, like all of us who I'm assuming are watching this video, we know what he did in the ring. We know how great he was in terms of a professional wrestler and the accolades that he was able to accumulate throughout the course of his career. But I cannot help but think about how it all ended. And Because of that, we will never talk about him in a public forum. When it comes to WWE, obviously, for stuff like this, you and I, we can talk about him, but there will always be that dark cloud hanging over us when it comes to that discussion. I really enjoyed seeing Christopher Nowinski, the Harvard graduate from WWE, and how they really dove into the importance of CTE. And it opened up a lot of eyes in terms of the discussion that they had. A guy like Stone Cold Steve Austin, who says he doesn't believe in CTE. And it's like, listen, I'm an Austin guy. I love Stone Cold. I don't agree with that. I think that was, I don't know. That's his opinion. That's fine. Um, but you can't, how can you say CTE is not real when you have repeated blows to the head? Of course, the skull is designed, to protect the brain, but there are head injuries. And I feel like once you have so many over the course of your lifetime, it only adds up. You hit your arm so many times against a wall, it's going to begin to bruise, is it not? So for him to say something like, basically assuming he wasn't a good professional wrestler because you're supposed to protect yourself. And if you're getting concussions after concussions, you're doing something wrong. It's like, well, that's not even how it happens sometimes. Sometimes you don't have to hit your head super hard. It's just a sudden movement that may jolt your brain in a certain way that results in a concussion. I think The Undertaker was another one who, upon the CTE discovery, they had removed chair shots to the head. And again, I can remember that. I remember when they went to PG, there was no more blood, there was no more chair shots to the head. For better or for worse, as a pro wrestling fan, those are things that you know and love in professional wrestling, and that's old school for Undertaker. So of course he's upset that they're going to be getting rid of the staples of what he has built his career on. But at least he had the foresight, at least he had the understanding of, okay, it's for the sake of the business. But I don't even think it was for the business. It's for the sake of the business and for the health of the talent. You look at the WWE now. We don't get chair shots to the head. We've barely gotten blood back in 15 years? And the business is still thriving. One could argue the business is as hot as it has ever been. And that's without chair shots to the head. That's with seldom appearances of blood on TV. Again, we're getting them a little bit more often when it comes to WWE TV. But it's not the main basis that it was founded upon. Its storytelling. As long as you get a good story, it'll take care of itself. Speaking of The Undertaker, the streak ending. I thought this was a very interesting talking point because, again, sticking on the conversation of concussions, The Undertaker famously suffered a concussion at WrestleMania 30 during his matchup against Brock Lesnar, where he would unfortunately lose his first WrestleMania match, resulting in the record of 21-1. It is well known that he had a concussion in that matchup, but Vince McMahon made some kind of comment where it wasn't necessarily a concussion. I think he was just in shock that he was going to lose that night. How, again, maybe taken out of context, I don't know. I didn't edit the docuseries, but how are you going to say something like that when it's known that Undertaker went to the hospital following that match, and who went with him to the hospital? Vince McMahon. That one boggled my mind, that he had said something like that. I don't know. A lot of topics were talked about. Obviously, the ongoing allegations and accusations pointed towards him, involving the whole Janelle Grant situation, the trafficking. That is stuff that's still being discussed. We can talk about it, of course, but there's still ongoing investigations, ongoing trial issues. So there might be more details coming out, and that's something I thought was an interesting take on this. The last episode is that it seemed like whenever we were about to end, it's like boom, 2 days later, boom, this happened, and it's like it was just piling on top of each other. One guy in particular, Bruce Pritchard, who was a Vince McMahon guy, and I totally get it. My opinions on Bruce don't change. I'm a fan of Bruce Pritchard. I enjoy his podcast. I enjoy what he brought to professional wrestling, what he still brings to professional wrestling. But when it comes to his stance on Vince McMahon, I get it. You've known the guy for 40 years. You have a sense of loyalty towards him. And it's difficult because I'm sure out there, if you have someone that you've known for 40 years that you love and respect, you want to be there to support them. I totally get that. But it's like every time he had said something, it got contradicted by another allegation, by another controversy, by another scandal. One after the other. He voiced his opinion saying that he thought it was garbage. He did the early episodes of the docuseries that he saw because it seemed like a hit piece. Listen, I get it. I totally get it. It seems like a hit piece on Vince McMahon because they piled so much against him. But when you have so much, have a history that they can pile against you, how are they not going to? I say this analogy all the time to my brother when we watch football. Sometimes you gotta play ball. You gotta play better than the referee's ref. And what I mean by that is, if you're not doing anything wrong, how can they call a penalty on you? If you're not doing anything wrong in life, how is anybody going to charge you for something? How are they going to accuse you of something? He has so many accusations against him. One of them is going to stick. But unfortunately, he has so many of them that it is the size, the font on my phone that I'm looking at for my notes is like huge because there's just so many. There's so many. To close, I did want to talk about some of the interesting testimonials that a lot of the professional wrestlers had shared about Vince McMahon, Hulk Hogan in particular, which I thought was fascinating because they thought if Vince was gone from the business, would it succeed? And Hulk Hogan said no, he didn't think it would succeed. We are 2 years without Vince, and like I said, the company is thriving. It is the hottest it has been. We've had the biggest WrestleMania of all time at WrestleMania 40. We're having expansions to other countries such as France, Berlin. Obviously, the Saudi deal is still going. Australia had a show earlier this year. It's thriving, is what it is. Vince was able to build a global phenomenon, like I mentioned. And now that he's gone, now that for the first time ever, there is no McMahon, there's no Linda, there's no Shane, there's no Vince, there's no Stephanie, there's no one. It is still thriving. It's still going. And it will continue to go. I have no doubt in my mind it will continue to grow. What was also interesting was Vince McMahon's take on the business. We knew that he was very big on differentiating personal from business. So towards the end of his tenure with the WWE, he did become a member of the board. But because of the acquisition by Endeavor, forming TKO, he was no longer like a majority owner, so they kind of forced him out. And I thought that was very ironic, very poetic, that it wasn't personal, it was just business that he had to leave, that he was forced out. He also talked about the law of the jungle and how it was like the survival of the fittest. And Paul Heyman, who I thought was a great addition to these testimonials, to these talking heads, where he also brought it back to the law of the jungle, that he was ushered out by the new up-and-coming regime that is TKO. Very ironic, very appropriate, I thought. Another thing was one of the final questions that they had asked the wrestlers, and that was, what is the legacy of Vince McMahon? And you had guys and girls, like Trish Stratus, The Undertaker, Booker T, that were asked, what is the legacy? And all struggled. They were hesitant. They couldn't find the words. But the one that I thought was very telling, John Cena. If you follow John Cena and the interviews that he has, very articulate, very well spoken. He has an answer for everything, and the way he expresses himself with his words, I think is artistry. Quite frankly, the way he's able to speak. And even he couldn't come up with one. He said, maybe I'm not the one that should answer this. That's telling. For me, that's telling. We won't really know what the legacy of Vince McMahon is until I think these, the recent allegations are dealt with or addressed. I know from a professional standpoint, he is one of the greatest wrestling minds of all time. And I believe, I don't know if it was Tony Atlas, my memory might be wrong here. He's one of the greatest promoters of all time. And I think that's a fact. But much like Chris Benoit, it's his personal actions that will derail that legacy that he's helped built over the course of his career. Vince McMahon, excuse me, Vince McMahon said it best himself, and that in the ending of that documentary, he had said, there comes a point where people in their line of work, and this isn't verbatim, but people in their line of work, who begin to lose a sense of reality and differentiating the person from the character. For years on screen, we saw Vince McMahon as like this evil, boss who hated his employees and didn't care what the fans thought. It was just for the betterment of his company, of his business. I don't know if it's an instance of art imitating life or life imitating art, but somewhere along the lines, I think the lines were blurred for Vince McMahon. Whether it was his opportunity to blur the lines in the sense of like, hey, this is what I'm getting away with on TV, so I can always just chalk it up to it's entertainment, it's kayfabe, or whether it was a reflection of his reality. I don't think we'll ever know. Like I said, I think the legacy of Vince is yet to be determined, but I do not think history will look fondly upon Vince McMahon. That's just my 2 cents. That's my opinion, but I would love to hear your guys's. I want you guys to go ahead and comment down below. What are your thoughts on the docuseries that Netflix had released regarding Vince McMahon? If you enjoyed this lengthy review / reaction to the docuseries, please give the video a thumbs up and a like. And then don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep up to date with all the videos that I produce here revolving around pro wrestling. And with that being said, of course, my name is Jose Ramos Jr. I want to thank you guys for stopping by and hanging out with me. And I'll see you guys in the next one.